Hello and welcome. We are here on the Healthy Mourning channel, and I want to welcome you. My name is Maria Kliavkov, and I am the author of Healthy Mourning, Happy Loving, and I am the creator of Healthy Mourning Revolution, which is all about revolutionizing the way we think about grief and mourning, because in North America, we don't really have a good handle on it. We have never been taught how to grieve and mourn appropriately. We don't even know the difference between grief and mourning. So that's what we're here to talk about. Today's topic is all about funerals and good funerals and why it's so important to have funerals. So here's the thing. Right now in the grief pandemic, and for those of you who are watching this at a later date, we are just in the middle of this grief pandemic, which is coming from the COVID-19 situation. And in this situation, families have not been able to have funerals, and it's starting to show why funerals are so important and why rituals have been done since the beginning of time. The reality is, one of the first needs of mourning that's identified by Dr. Alan Wolfelt is the need to face the reality of our loss. And so funerals are really crucial in helping us to come to terms with the fact that our loved one has died. In many cases, particularly recently, people have gone to hospitals and loved ones have not been able to visit them in the hospital, and so nobody's been able to be with them in this sharp decline. Maybe they've talked to them over the phone or in Facebook, but they haven't been able to be in the room with them. And that part of really acknowledging that somebody has died has always been a function of wakes and funerals. And so we need that opportunity to come to that understanding that our loved one has died. We also need that time to begin to talk about what matters to us, our memories, and share those memories with others. And that's what funerals allow us to do. It allows us to share our happy memories and our sad memories. And when we start talking about our memories with each other, what happens is we begin to shift where our relationship with our loved one is. We shifted from being in present time into it being a place of memory where we recognize that those memories are where we go to be with our loved one and to visit them. And so it's so important that we have the funeral as a passageway and a pathway to opening up those stories and sharing those stories with our loved ones. In many parts of the world right now, funerals have not been allowed to happen. In other parts of the world, they've been limited to 10 people. In some cases, funerals have happened via Zoom meetings and such in order to bring people together. And all of those situations have been about making sure that people have a pathway to express their sadness and to connect with each other. And most of all, the number 3 reason why we have funerals is for support, because we really need to reach out to one another and to support one another. And in this time of social distancing, can you think of anything more important than at a time of a loved one's death, feeling that social support? And funerals have always been social gatherings. It's a place where your community gets to support you and hold you and help you as you come to terms with the loss. And so it's really important that we continue some pathway of having that connection and that support, right? It's also important that we understand that this is a time for us to convert our grief to mourning. What funerals do is it gives us a pathway and a socially accepted time when we can take those feelings that we've been feeling inside, the fears and the sadness and the loss, and we can express it. Funerals are where it is socially acceptable to cry, where it is socially acceptable to talk about your feelings. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of occasions when it's socially acceptable to do this. So it's vitally important that we have these funerals. And the reality is, rituals are what we do when we don't have words. And at a time of a funeral, most people don't have words. And so finding the rituals that are appropriate during the course of the funeral, finding the right music, finding the way to maybe show picture shows or something, that's so vitally important. because what we want to do is, like I said before, we want to gather in the memory of our loved one, right? And we want to share in those memories, and there's no better way to do that than pictures. And so those slideshows that honor the life of the person who we've lost is very important. Because there are really two functions to a funeral. Number one is to honor the life of the person who has gone before, and number two is to be together in our grieving as we convert our grief to mourning. So the difference between grief and mourning is grief is the internal experience, the feelings, the thoughts that are going through our head and going through our heart around the loss. Mourning is the external expression of those feelings, and if we don't have that avenue to express it out and to convert our grief to mourning, then we run the risk of buried and carried grief. We run the risk of keeping it all inside, and it's so vital to convert our grief to mourning. That's why I talk about the healthy mourning revolution, learning how to convert our grief to mourning in healthy ways that allow us to continue in our grief journey and not get stuck in it. And when we don't have funerals, when we don't have memorials, when we don't have these pathways, quite often people get stuck in their loss and in their grief, and they don't know how to convert it to mourning. So it's really important to do this, right? This also gives us a space to ask those questions that are coming up. Part of the thought process is we start to ask the bigger questions about life and death and the meaning of life, and it becomes so important that we have a pathway where we can sit with those questions and just be with the questions without feeling the need to find an answer for the question, to be willing to sit in the uncomfortable place of not knowing and yet willing to ask. And when we do that in group at a funeral, that is a powerful, powerful exercise. And it gives us a context to the life question, to the arc of a life, to the meaning of a life, particularly the life of the person who just passed, right? The other thing that it allows us to do is when somebody dies, we're asking questions of ourselves. We start to question what's important in our lives and finding a way to shift who we are in the world and how we show up in the world, because suddenly the focus is keenly on what is important in life. And certainly what's been going on in the world in the last couple of weeks has asked us to look at what's important in our life. What are the changes we need to make? What is the change that we want to be in the world? What do we want to achieve in our lifetime and pass on to the next generation? These are all really important questions, and they tend to be looked at the time of a funeral. It's also important to note that one funeral usually is not enough, that we need rituals, because again, like I said before, rituals are what we do when we don't have words. And so throughout our grief journey, we find ourselves needing to do varying rituals. And so in the podcast that I'm going to be doing, which is also being released this week, the podcast is going to talk about how to do many different rituals throughout your grieving process and the importance of embracing a number of different rituals and what that might look like. So I invite you to come on over to that podcast. I'll put the link to it in the description here. I'm also going to be doing another video later this week, and that video is going to be a resource review, because once a week I do a resource review for a book that may be of support to you, and I was looking for a book that might help around the funeral conversation, and Dr. Alan Wofelt, my mentor and teacher, wrote a beautiful book. It's one of my favorite books about grief, and it's The Paradoxes of Mourning. And it talks about, in order to go through the grief process and access the mourning, to convert the grief to mourning, there are some fundamental paradoxes. And in the book he talks about 3 different paradoxes. But the first is the importance of saying hello. We have this temptation to say goodbye before we ever say hello, and how funerals are actually an opportunity to say hello to the grief journey. So I'm going to do a resource review on that book this week. So in order to see that, please subscribe to this YouTube channel, the Healthy Mourning channel. And with that subscription, of course, you'll get to see all of these right away. And if you want to see more resources, if you want to join us in the Healthy Mourning Revolution live launch, which is coming up, please go to healthymourning.com. I'll put that link in the description as well. I'm wishing you ease and grace in your grief journey. Namaste.